Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Isabela Suarez, or Isabella, and I'll be presenting on colonialism and health in Mexico for HPS 433. And in this presentation, I'll just be explaining what colonialism basically is and give a brief history of Spanish colonialism in Mexico and how colonial legacies continue to shape health outcomes today, and finally share 3 recommendations for how we can decolonize global health. So for the first thing I'm going to talk about is basically what is colonialism. Colonialism is a system which occurs when a strong nation controls and takes advantage of another region on a political, economic, or cultural level. Cultural suppression, forced labor, and resource extraction are all part of it. Colonialism isn't just about military conquest. It restructures an entire society or entire societies to benefit the colonizing power, leaving behind deep inequalities. Even after independence, the systems created during colonialism often remain in place, shaping institutions, economics, and health outcomes for generations and generations after as well. So, how was colonialism in Mexico? Or how did this happen? What's the history behind it? Mexico was a Spanish colony from 1521 to 1821, which is a pretty long time. Disease and conquest decimated, which basically means destroyed, indigenous civilizations like the Aztec indigenous civilization and the Mayan indigenous civilization. And epidemics like smallpox killed millions of people. When the Spanish arrived, they imposed a big colonial system centered on extraction, so which means not wanting these communities, these indigenous people there, taking resources from them and making them do labor for the benefit of the Spanish. This transformed land ownership completely, governance, and social hierarchies across Mexico. Like I said, the epidemics killed up to 17 million indigenous people between the years 1545 and 1576, which caused a huge demographic collapse. These epidemics destroyed families and social structures, laying the foundation for centuries of inequality and poor health outcomes that we still see today. It was one of the greatest population losses in human history and one of the most devastating early impacts of disease, and it laid the foundation, like I said, for these poor outcomes health outcomes that we still see today. Colonial institutions and inequality, encomienda and hacienda systems, which concentrated wealth and excluded indigenous people, were the foundation of colonial Mexico. For colonial elites, resources and land were taken, and these systems often concentrated wealth and power while the indigenous populations faced poverty and severe malnutrition. Land and political power remained in the hands of the elites, which this is post-independent legacies. They continued after the country gained independence in 1821, and they continued to be deprived of rights while elites held onto their land and political influence. What is the health in Mexico today? So, the health in Mexico today, according to the Pan American Health Organization, or PAHO, the life expectancy of a Mexican or Hispanic in Mexico is about 75.3 years, and the infant mortality is 12.6 per 1,000 births. The maternal mortality is 59.1 per 100,000 births. And public health spending is just about 3% of GDP, while 41% of total health spending comes from people's own pockets. So these numbers just show progress, but they also reveal a healthcare system that still struggles with inequality and limited access for a lot of people, including indigenous communities still. So these are just some health disparities in indigenous communities still happening in Mexico today. So 78.7% of indigenous Mexicans live in poverty, while 39.4% in extreme poverty. Twice the maternal mortality rate of non-indigenous women, which are often Spanish women or people that or families that were colonized that aren't necessarily indigenous in Mexico. COVID-19 mortality twice as high as in non-indigenous groups. So the COVID-19 mortality was not as high in indigenous groups, which is very unfair. And so here I included a graph of the impact of healthcare expenditure in indigenous communities. So as you can see, the percentage of indigenous and non-indigenous households that had a catastrophic health expenditure, more than 30% of their income, you can see that indigenous households do have a bigger healthcare expenditure when it comes to healthcare. It really impacts them a lot more, which is sad. And these disparities aren't just about biology. They reflect the structural inequalities that trade back to colonialism. So these aren't things that just appeared out of nowhere or that stem from somewhere recently. These issues go back and back generations from when the Spanish colonized Mexico. So that's why colonialism and health is very important in this aspect. So some of the more colonial legacy and structural inequality, economic marginalization and inadequate infrastructure, poor access to healthcare are examples of structural hurdles that were brought about by colonial land confiscation and exclusion that were brought by colonialism. Colonialism undermined trust and health autonomy by imposing Western medicine and devaluing indigenous knowledge. So these same regions remain the most vulnerable today, showing how the geography of colonialism continues to map onto the geography of poor health. So connecting the past with the present. Today's health disparities are a result of colonial legacies, including systematic racism, unfair resource allocation, and underinvestment of indigenous areas. Traditional healing practices were labeled as superstition, and indigenous people were often included a lot from healthcare systems. Even today, cultural and language barriers lead to mistrust in health institutions and lower quality care for indigenous patients. Decolonizing health means respecting these diverse ways of knowledge and healing. When we look at Mexico's health today, between the urban and rural, indigenous and non-indigenous, it's clear that they're not accidents. They're the result of centuries of structural exclusion, unequal and wealth distribution, all rooted in colonialism. Colonialism's effects are not just historical. They are structural and they still continue. So how can we decolonize global health? And here's the first recommendation. Centering indigenous leadership and knowledge in health policy is extremely important. Programs should be co-designed with communities and not imposed on them. Intercultural health models in Mexico, which blend Western and indigenous medicine, have already shown much success by improving trust and outcomes. And then here's a little image of the power the power and privilege that a lot of people have. I found this art on an article on decolonizing global health in indigenous communities and other communities that were colonized. And I found this form of art very beautiful and motivating, inspiring. And then this is the second and third recommendation for decolonizing global health. Redistributing resources to historically marginalized regions. This means investing more in indigenous and rural communities, especially in infrastructure, clean water, maternal care. Reallocate funds to communities that have been underserved, basically. And then the third is to reform basically global health governance to ensure that everyone gets an equal amount of care. So institutions in the global south should lead research and policy making, not just implement programs designed somewhere else. So tree decolonization means shifting power, not just sharing it. Because if we're just sharing it, we might not get the chance to really fully create that equality. Sometimes you have to give more power to underserved communities. Those would be my recommendations. And for just to conclude on this whole topic, very important topic, colonialism shaped Mexico's health inequalities through economic extraction, cultural domination. It profoundly shaped Mexico's health systems and health disparities in general. In the Spanish colonial model of extraction and exclusion still echoes in poverty, in access to healthcare and health outcomes today in Mexico. However, to build a more equitable future, global health must confront its colonial roots, and that is still possible, which is a very big picture or a very big indicator or like hope, given of hope, which is great. But you could do this by valuing indigenous knowledge, redistributing resources like I mentioned before, and just centering the community leadership by joining everyone to basically do this. Because with community, or with a lot of people wanting to do this, it's going to be a faster and easier process, because this was created out of exclusion and division, and just bringing it together will just make everything a quicker, easier, and a much better process. So hopefully with a lot of help and a lot of unity with public health workers, this can be further helped, further assisted, these issues. And colonialism will no longer be as big of an issue as it is today, just as other issues in the world like racism and the power of privilege within many communities that aren't within the minority groups. So hopefully this becomes something that we all learned from and we all grow from. And that was my presentation on colonialism and health in Mexico, and I hope you got something from this. As a Hispanic in Mexico, and I have full indigenous blood myself, I resonate a lot with this topic, and I resonate a lot with my family in Mexico that's also in indigenous communities and that also help serve their country in the same way as I'm trying to in public health. So I hope this gives you a piece of information, and we all join in helping with these issues. So thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your semester. Bye. Thank you.